Hi, John. How are you?
Fine, how are you?
Baruch Hashem, good. Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to the Daily Living Jewish Kitzur Shulchan Aruch class. Today we are beginning section 62 of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch after a long break, just to start with a brief recap of where we are up to in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Sorry, let's get this up here. We are up to section 62. So I've divided the whole of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch into about 12 sections. We started the day and moved on to davening, and then the laws of Torah study, proper conduct, preparing food, meals and food, blessings. And today we begin a brand new section that discusses all the laws of business. This is all available on our YouTube channel. You can look back and pick up anything that you missed. And in the laws of business, we are going to be covering 7 sections, starting with upright business dealings, and then in general, upright communications and interactions, doing business with illegal products or prohibited products. A big topic is interests, which involves everybody's lives, and then ISKA, which is a solution to avoid interest, and then we'll continue with vows and oaths, which obviously come into play when making deals, and then finally while traveling. But for today, we start with upright business dealings, section 62. And this is a section that from when I first began to learn it in greater depth, it amazed me of as far as how it's really difficult. You would say that any man of integrity surely has upright business dealings, but really it requires a lot of moral courage for most of us. And we'll see that when we learn the laws, how it surfaces in different ways. Let's take a look at the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, whose text we are following. So either you can look at the text with me on the right, or you can follow on the left, where I've just got a brief overview of the halachas that we are learning. So the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch begins, you should be extremely careful not to deceive your fellow man. If anyone deceives his fellow, whether a seller deceives a buyer or a buyer deceives a seller, always find that line fascinating. We'll get back to that in a moment. He transgresses a negative command. One of the 613 commandments is that when you sell something to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor, do not deceive one another. So one of the 613 mitzvahs is not to be deceptive in business, in transactions. In fact, the Gemara says the first question a person is asked when he is brought before the heavenly courts after 120, when he's judged for all of his actions, the first question that is asked is, have you always been honest in your dealings? So not only is this a mitzvah, it's a very important mitzvah, a mitzvah which we will be asked about when we make our way to heaven, or hopefully Mashiach will be there before then. But either way, this indicates the importance of not being deceptive. Okay, well, who would want to be deceptive? Nobody would want to be deceptive. So I said I'd touch upon buying from your neighbor. So my understanding, what I thought would be the case was that if you're a seller and you are overcharging the purchaser, then that's a problem. It's deceptive. Now, obviously, this begs a lot of questions, because who determines if you are overcharging or undercharging? And we'll speak more about that. But interestingly, from the Torah's perspective, the mitzvah applies equally to the seller as to the buyer, which means that if you know that the price that you're paying is less than what the seller should be asking for, unless you know definitively that the seller is aware of its true value and he's chosen to charge it to you, to sell it to you at a discount, unless that's clear, you're actually not allowed to pay the price that he's offering to take without disclosure. So really the key over here is disclosure. After all, this is deceit in one form or another, intentionally or unintentionally. Once you have disclosure, then there's no problem at all. So that means that if you're coming to buy a car and the seller is willing to sell it to you for a really cheap price, he says, "Yep, 40,000 rand, and the car is yours." And you think that maybe he's like, something's a little off. Why is he selling this car for 40,000 rand if he could sell it for 80,000? So unless you know that he knows what he could be getting for it or what its approximate value is, you would actually need to tell him, "Are you aware that this car you want to sell me has a much higher going value?" And the moment you tell him that, or you don't even ask him that, once you say that, although this item is worth a lot more, this is the price I'm willing to pay, so then it's his choice. He could decide what to do. But that disclosure needs to happen both ways, not only on the side of the seller. Not only can't the seller overcharge, but the buyer is not allowed to underpay without disclosure. That's, I think, one already mental change that we need to have when engaging in commerce. The second mental change is that you can't assume unless you know. So, or let me say it more specifically. The typical approach to business is everybody worries about themselves. The seller needs to make sure that he's done his research, and the buyer needs to take care of doing his research. But really, from a Torah perspective, that's wrong. The seller and buyer need to be having each other's interest in mind as well. So as long as, either way, you can't say that it's his problem or it's his responsibility to find out. If it's clear, if he knows, then great. But if he doesn't know, then since you're transacting with him, you have a responsibility to tell him, which goes both ways. Whether you're the seller and you're charging more than what the item could be worth or is worth, or you're a buyer and you're charging less than what, and you're paying less than what the item is worth, you cannot say it's his problem, it's his responsibility. Rather, Kol Yisrael, or Arabian said, we all have a responsibility for each other. And since I'm transacting with him, I need to be sure that both of us are being covered. Now, that doesn't mean you need to become his attorney. It doesn't mean you should tell him, "Don't sell me the product." It just means that you need to be sure that he is not being fooled. So you don't need to convince him into anything, but you just want to be sure that there is that basic education, that there is that basic knowledge of the true value of an item. And I'm sure he'll discuss this later, but this next final point is a very important point. And that is, everybody's going to say, how do you determine the price for anything, the value of anything? Everything's up for debate. Like back to the car. Who says it's worth 40,000 or 60,000 or 80,000? How long is a piece of string? Isn't this all just up for grabs? And the answer is no. There is a parameter. Now there is an area which is within that parameter, which is negligible. The Shulchan Aruch speaks about a sixth, where up to a sixth there could be room for error. But even that sixth is where it's undetermined. But what is determined is determined. Let me say what I'm saying in simple words. What I'm saying in simple words is that there are gray areas and there are black and white. And what's gray is gray, and what's black and white is black and white, and we cannot confuse the two. So what this means in practical terms is that, back to the car. So how do you determine the value of the car? I'm looking to sell a car. How do I determine the value of my car? So it goes by that time and that place. This is what the Shulchan Aruch says. Okay, so it doesn't matter what cars are going for in Europe or anywhere else in the world. It matters what cars are going for in South Africa, Johannesburg. And that time, it doesn't matter what cars were going for a month ago or what they will be going for in a month from now. It matters right now, in this time and this place, what is the going rate? Okay. Now there will be a margin, but it's a limited margin. So you can actually look up and find the actual going rate of the vehicle right now. So it could be you'll look it up and you'll see, okay, the rate of this vehicle right now is 70,000 rands. Okay, but what about the conditions? Maybe it's a little scratched, or maybe it has this and that. Okay, so then you have somewhat of a bracket. So if the going rate, which you could look up online, is 73,000, so you could say that the car in Johannesburg in 2020 or 2021, almost 2022, right now the value is somewhere between 60 and 80 under these conditions. So that's all within the value of the car. But once you go lower than that, then that's the seat, unless you disclose. So suddenly a guy's selling, I mean, I would worry if a guy put a car on the market for 40 grand, maybe something's wrong with the car. But if you turned out that there was nothing wrong, and he's selling it for 40, and you know that there's no reason it should be going for less than 60, then you have a responsibility, not just for yourself, you have a responsibility to the seller to tell him that, although this car is going online for this and this, I assume you're aware of that, this is what I'm willing to offer. And then once there's been that disclosure, there is no deceit, there is no, in Hebrew, the term is ayna'a, and then you could go ahead with the transaction. Or in the reverse, if I was the seller and I wanted to sell my car that's listed for 73 grand, I wanted to sell it for 90 grand, then I would need to tell the buyer, you're aware that the going rate is, I assume you're aware that such a car goes for this and this price, but I'm not willing to sell it for anything less than 90 grand. And then once there's been that disclosure, there's no deceit, and then you would be able to go ahead with the transaction. So I guess these are already two key take-homes as far as upright business dealings. Number one, that the law against deceit applies equally for the buyer as it does for the seller. The buyer is also not allowed to be deceitful to the seller, or even to, and number two, is that we all need to care for each other. We can't just spend for ourselves. What that means is that if I suspect that the buyer or seller are not aware, if it's possible that they're not aware of the true value of the item, which I'm not paying, then I would need to look after them, not just after myself. Maybe what this means in very practical terms, and I'm not sure to what extent this is necessary. I mean, when we purchased our home, the seller took us around the home to actually show us any possible problems there were with the property that we would just be aware of, which is, I think, quite unheard of in today's day and age. And that was just a real exemplification of this concept, where he both was making sure that I wasn't assuming that the item was something that it wasn't, that I was aware where it was, and that way it would be a fair transaction. Let's take a look at the next halacha. But before we do, any questions? No, ready to move on. Okay, so the prohibition of deception in business or upright business dealings applies equally for sales as it does in buying, as it does in hiring, in working on contract, and in money exchanging. So the same law would apply if you were going to rent a home. Again, who's going to decide how much a home is worth? But I say there is a certain bracket. If you're in that bracket, then that's the going rate. But if you're outside of the brackets, then that's a problem. So if I am charging for, if I have a cottage to let in Oakland, and I decide that it's only worth my while to rent it out if somebody will pay me 20 grand a month, then it's okay. I can make that decision. But when I do enlist it and somebody does come and make an offer, I have a responsibility to be sure that the renter is aware that I'm charging about outside of the bracket of what's acceptable. And then he has his choice. Maybe he'll say, I just love the garden and I'm more than happy to pay that extra amount, then that's fine. So it applies also in hiring, obviously cars, homes, or any items, any article that you're renting out, and in working on contracts again, And finally, money exchanging. So that's in any form of interaction, you need to be sure that there is that complete disclosure. Now we come to halacha number 3, which in Hebrew is called Nasata Be'emudah. The Gemara says that when a person goes up to heaven, we mentioned it earlier, he's going to be asked, did you do dealings with honesty? Now, it doesn't literally mean were you honest, it means something more specific. What this means is as follows. I'll discuss it outside and then we'll run through it inside. Now, if I don't want to bear the responsibility of determining the true value and ensure that I'm not overcharging or underpaying, well, I don't have time or patience for it. So the value can be determined, but I'm not interested in determining that. So let's take a practical example. Let's say I bought an iPhone. Okay, I bought an iPhone and then I decide I want to sell it. Okay, and I bought that iPhone for whatever it is, 3,000 Rand. And now I want to sell it for the same price I bought it for, 3,000 Rand. Now, I don't know what an iPhone is worth today in Johannesburg, whatever generation iPhone I have. So doing business dealings with emudah means I can tell the buyer, the purchaser, that, look, this is what I paid for it, and this is what I'm charging you, irrelevant of its true value. That's a form of disclosure that works. If I tell the potential purchaser that I don't know its value, but this is how much I bought it for, this is how much I'm making it, this is how much I want to sell it for, or if I tell them I bought it for 3,000 and I'm selling it for 4,000, regardless of what it's worth, then that works. So even though the iPhone might be worth 2,000 and I've just sold it to him for 4,000, and I should have a responsibility to tell him that he's underpaid. But if I decide I want to take another avenue, instead of going by value, I want to go by complete transparency. I want to tell him this is how much I bought it for and this is how much I want to sell it for, then that also works. Okay. Now, what about expenses involved? All right. So if I bought the iPhone for 3,000 rands, but I paid another 500 rand on shipping, so does that shipping cost, does that count as part of the expenses? So the answer would be yes. The Gemara speaks about this. What about if it took me about 3 hours to source this iPhone? And, I look up it took me 3 hours of my time. I'm not going to charge less than whatever it is, 200 rand an hour. So, okay, the iPhone, I'm going to say, actually, I purchased it for 3,500 rand, 3,000 rand for the, or 3,600 rand, 3,000 rand for the iPhone, and 600 rand for my time. No, says the Shulchan Aruch. That goes under profits. You would need to tell them, I bought it for 3,000 rand, I'm selling it for 3,600 rand, which means, obviously, that I'm making a profit of 600, and that's what profits are for. Profits are there to be able to live off them. So you can't charge for you can't include the value of your time in telling the potential buyer how much the item was worth. I see it's 5:20. We come to a close. Let's quickly see the halacha inside, and we'll wrap up with any final questions. So this is called doing business be'emudah, haneisim v'neisim be'emudah, or he translates it as if a person is candid in his dealings, he will not be guilty of deception. Meaning, if he says, I bought this article at this and this price, and I want to make a profit of so and so much, even though the seller was deceived and he overpaid for it. So here's a great one, right? I bought an iPhone for 3,000 rand, and then it turns out that it's only worth 2. So let me quickly sell it. Not so simple. I can't pass on my deceit to somebody else. Just because I was deceived, I can't deceive somebody else. So I can't go ahead. If I paid 3,000 but it's worth 2,000, I can't sell it for 3,000 unless I tell the buyer, this is what I paid and this is what I'm selling it for. And then you're basically clearly telling the buyer that it is we are not going by value. We're rather going by how much I'm gaining or losing. And then he will need to decide by himself whether he wants to purchase the article. Okay, tomorrow we'll please God discuss enhancing products to make them look better than they are.